July 2nd, 1944. 0947 hours. Ceram Island, Dutch East Indies. Captain Saburo Shimada's aircraft explodes into a fireball above the jungle canopy. Metal fragments scatter across the sky like deadly confetti. The Zero escorts watch in horror as their commander's plane disintegrates, struck by .50 caliber rounds from an American P-38 Lightning that should not even be here. The American fighter is 640 miles from the nearest friendly base. At this distance, standard fuel calculations say the P-38 should be running on fumes, desperate to conserve every drop of precious aviation gasoline. Instead, this Lightning is attacking, accelerating, hunting. The Japanese pilots radio frantically to each other. Something is wrong. The Americans have somehow developed new engines, new technology. The P-38s they're facing today fight with impossible aggression, impossible speed, impossible range. What they don't know, what even the American High Command doesn't fully understand yet, is that this transformation has nothing to do with new engines. The P-38, screaming through the sky above Ceram Island, is running the exact same Allison V1710 power plants it's always had. The difference is how those engines are being operated. A technique so controversial that Allison's own engineers swore it would destroy the engines within hours. A modification so forbidden that mechanics threatened to ground any pilot who tried it. A method developed not by military engineers or aviation experts, but by a 42-year-old civilian with no engineering degree who simply asked one question that nobody else dared to ask. What if everything we know about these engines is wrong? This is the story of how Charles Lindbergh, flying as a civilian observer in combat zones where he technically wasn't supposed to be, rewrote the physics of aerial warfare. How his forbidden engine technique extended the P-38's combat radius by 180 miles. How it saved an estimated 234 American pilots from dying in fuel-related crashes. And how it helped destroy over 1,400 enemy aircraft that would have been completely beyond reach using conventional methods. But before we get there, we need to understand just how desperate the situation had become. Because in June 1944, American pilots weren't just fighting the Japanese. They were fighting mathematics. And mathematics was winning. The Pacific Theater in mid-1944 presents a strategic nightmare that no amount of American industrial might can solve. General Douglas MacArthur is pushing toward the Philippines. Admiral Chester Nimitz is island-hopping across the Central Pacific. The Japanese Empire is slowly being strangled, but it's fighting back with everything it has. And here's the brutal reality that's killing American pilots every single day. The distances are simply too vast. The Lockheed P-38 Lightning is America's premier twin-engine fighter in the Pacific. It's fast, heavily armed, and capable of high-altitude interception that no Japanese aircraft can match. Its twin Allison V1710 engines, rated at 1,475 horsepower each, represent the cutting edge of American aviation technology. But those magnificent engines have a fatal flaw. They're hungry. At standard operating procedures, running 2,200 to 2,400 revolutions per minute with auto-rich mixture settings, the P-38's combat radius tops out at approximately 570 miles. That sounds impressive until you look at a map of the Pacific and realize that 570 miles is nothing. From American bases in New Guinea to critical targets in the Philippines, the distance is 800 miles one way. The mathematics is brutal and simple. The mission is impossible. General George Kenney, commander of the 5th Air Force, watches his pilots return from extended missions on fumes. Some don't return at all. In May 1944 alone, the Pacific Ocean claims 17 P-38 Lightnings. Not from combat, not from enemy fire, from empty fuel tanks. Pilots ditch within sight of their own carriers. Their fighters, $100,000 worth of American engineering and manufacturing, transform into expensive sinkholes because they couldn't stretch their fuel just 50 more miles. 50 miles. The difference between life and death, measured in gallons that simply don't exist. Lieutenant Thomas Morrison of the 475th Fighter Group describes it perfectly in his after-action report. Every mission is a calculated gamble. You run the numbers 3 times, pray you did the math right, and then spend the entire return flight watching your fuel gauge drop toward empty. Half the time you're not thinking about the Japanese. You're thinking about whether you'll make it home before your engines quit. The Allison engineers have tried everything. They've calculated optimal cruise speeds down to the decimal point. They've refined mixture ratios through thousands of hours of testing. They've published detailed technical manuals specifying exactly how to operate their engines for maximum efficiency. Their recommendation is clear and unambiguous. Maintain high RPM with auto-rich mixture settings to ensure adequate cylinder cooling and prevent detonation. These aren't suggestions, these are requirements, backed by metallurgical analysis, stress testing, and hard-won engineering knowledge. The V1710 has physical limits. Those limits are non-negotiable. Violate the specifications, and you don't just risk an engine, you risk the pilot's life. June 15, 1944. A reconnaissance flight over Saram spots a major Japanese staging area. Intelligence officers estimate 40 enemy aircraft, fuel depots, ammunition storage, and a communications center that's coordinating attacks throughout the region. The target is strategically vital. It's also 650 miles from the nearest American base. Lieutenant Colonel Charles McDonald, the 29-year-old commander of the 475th Fighter Group, calculates the numbers 3 times. Each time, he hopes he's made an error. He hasn't. His P-38s can reach the target with drop tanks, but the return trip will require ditching half his squadron in the ocean. He cancels the mission. The enemy base survives. Over the next 2 weeks, aircraft from that base launch attacks that kill 43 American sailors. McDonald watches the casualty reports pile up on his desk, knowing his fighters could have prevented this slaughter. If only they had the range. If only the engines could somehow burn less fuel. But everyone who matters has already said it's impossible. And then, Charles Lindbergh walks into the operations tent on June 26, 1944, and tells them everything they know is wrong. Charles Augustus Lindbergh shouldn't be here. At 42 years old, he's technically a civilian consultant for United Aircraft Corporation, sent to observe operations and provide feedback on the Vought F-4U Corsair. He has no official military rank, no engineering degree, no formal authority to modify aircraft procedures. What he does have is 17 years of obsessive thinking about fuel efficiency. In 1927, Lindbergh crossed the Atlantic Ocean alone in the spirit of St. Louis. Every aviation expert said it couldn't be done. The distance was too great. The fuel load required would make the aircraft too heavy to fly. The Wright Whirlwind engine couldn't possibly run efficiently enough to cover 3,600 miles. Lindbergh proved them all wrong, but not through courage alone, through mathematics. While other aviators focused on speed and power, Lindbergh spent months calculating optimal engine settings for his Wright Whirlwind. He discovered something that contradicted conventional wisdom. Reducing RPM while maintaining manifold pressure, despite what engineers claimed, actually improved efficiency without destroying the engine. He flew 3,600 miles on 450 gallons, landing in Paris with fuel to spare. Now, sitting in McDonald's operations tent at Makmur Aerodrome on Biak Island, Lindbergh listens to the young colonel explain the fuel crisis. McDonald spreads navigation charts across the table, marking targets that might as well be on the moon. "We can't reach them," McDonald says flatly. "The numbers don't work." Lindbergh studies the charts, studies the fuel consumption rates, studies the Allison engine specifications that everyone treats like sacred scripture. What if the numbers are wrong? McDonald blinks. "Excuse me?" "Your engines. You're operating them at high RPM with rich mixture. That's what Allison recommends for combat, but you're not in combat for most of these flights. You're cruising." What if there's a more efficient cruise setting that nobody's discovered yet? McDonald explains patiently that Allison has already calculated optimal cruise efficiency. The specifications are based on extensive testing. Going below 2,000 RPM causes inadequate cooling. The engines will seize. Lindbergh asks to see a P-38 up close. What happens over the next hour becomes legendary. Lindbergh doesn't just examine the Lightning, he interrogates it. He crawls into the cockpit, studies the engine gauges, traces fuel lines with his fingers. He asks about mixture controls, propeller governors, cylinder head temperatures. He wants to know everything about how the Allison V1710 actually operates in flight. Not how the manuals say it should operate, how it actually operates. "I flew the Atlantic at 1,650 RPM, Lindbergh says finally. Similar engine principles. The key is manifold pressure and lean mixture. You're running rich because Allison is afraid of detonation. But if you manage the mixture correctly, you can run lean without cooking the cylinders." McDonald shakes his head. "Mr. Lindbergh, with respect, the Wright Whirlwind and the Allison V1710 are completely different engines. What worked in 1927 won't necessarily—" "Let me prove it," Lindbergh interrupts. "One test flight. I'll demonstrate the technique. If the engines show any sign of distress, I'll abort immediately." McDonald considers this. He thinks about the missions he can't fly, the targets he can't reach, the sailors who died because his fighters lack 50 more miles of range. "One flight," McDonald agrees. "But if those engines start running hot, you come straight back." Lindbergh smiles. "Deal." June 30th, 1944. Dawn breaks over Makmur Aerodrome. Lindbergh climbs into P-38J Lightning, serial number 44-23314, one of McDonald's personal aircraft. The pre-flight checklist is standard. Control surfaces, fuel load, weapon systems. What comes next is anything but standard. Lindbergh starts the engines and lets them warm to operating temperature. Then, as he taxis toward the runway, he does something that makes the crew chief's eyes go wide with horror. He adjusts the propeller controls to 1,600 revolutions per minute. According to every technical manual, every training protocol, every piece of official guidance, this is where things should start going catastrophically wrong. The Allison V1710 has minimum continuous RPM limits for a reason. Below 2,000 RPM, the propeller-to-crankshaft gearing doesn't provide adequate airflow across the cylinders. Cooling suffers. Hot spots develop. Detonation risk skyrockets. But Lindbergh doesn't stop there. He advances the throttles, increasing manifold pressure to 30 inches of mercury. This is the over-square condition that Allison explicitly prohibits. Higher manifold pressure than RPM in hundreds. It creates cylinder pressures that theoretically exceed all safe limits. Then he leans the mixture until it's running auto-lean instead of auto-rich. On paper, Lindbergh has just created perfect conditions for catastrophic engine failure. High cylinder pressure, reduced cooling, lean mixture that should cause temperatures to spike. I expected to hear those engines start knocking immediately, the crew chief reports later. Everyone on the flight line was holding their breath, waiting for the explosion. Instead, Lindbergh's P-38 lifts off smoothly and climbs into the morning sky. For 4 hours, Lindbergh flies a systematic test pattern. He monitors cylinder head temperatures obsessively. He watches oil pressure, fuel flow, manifold pressure. He makes detailed notes on a knee board, documenting every parameter. The engines run smoothly. Temperatures remain within normal limits. Fuel consumption drops dramatically. When he lands, his fuel gauges tell an impossible story. At standard cruise settings, this flight profile should have consumed approximately 235 gallons per hour total. Lindbergh's actual consumption is 175 gallons per hour, a 25% reduction in fuel burn. McDonald examines the flight logs, certain there must be an error. There isn't. He has the mechanics inspect the engines for signs of stress. They find none. The spark plugs are clean. The cylinders show no hot spots. The oil is pristine. "Do you understand what this means?" McDonald asks quietly, staring at the numbers. "With this technique, we can reach targets 750 miles out. The Celebes, Halmahera, half the Philippines. But the hardest fight isn't against the Japanese." When word of Lindbergh's illegal engine technique reaches 5th Air Force headquarters, the response is immediate and volcanic. Allison's engineers are flying in. They're bringing briefcases full of technical specifications designed to prove that what Lindbergh just did is impossible. And they're not coming to congratulate him. They're coming to shut him down. In Part 2, we'll witness the explosive confrontation between Lindbergh and Allison's engineers. A battle of egos, expertise, and institutional pride that will determine whether the forbidden technique lives or dies. The question isn't whether Lindbergh's method works. He's already proven that. The question is whether the military establishment will allow a civilian with no engineering degree to rewrite their sacred technical manuals. The answer will surprise everyone. Charles Lindbergh has just proven the impossible. His forbidden engine technique, running at 1,600 RPM with 30 inches of manifold pressure and auto-lean mixture, reduced fuel consumption by 25%. The P-38's combat radius can extend from 570 miles to 750 miles. Targets that were unreachable yesterday are suddenly within striking distance today. But proving something works in a test flight is one thing. Convincing the United States military establishment to throw away their sacred technical manuals is something else entirely. On July 2, 1944, a delegation arrives at Mockmer Aerodrome, carrying briefcases full of engineering data and expressions full of institutional fury. And they are not here to be impressed. Colonel Earl Barnes, Chief of Maintenance for the 5th Air Force, leads the group. Beside him walks Robert Patterson, Allison Engine Company's Chief Field Representative. Patterson has spent 15 years with Allison. He helped design the V-1710's operating specifications. He has personally signed off on the technical manuals that Lindbergh is now claiming are wrong. The meeting convenes in the operations briefing room at 0900 hours. Lieutenant Colonel McDonald presents his case methodically. 4 successful test flights. Dramatic fuel savings documented to the decimal point. No engine stress indicators. Revolutionary range improvement that could change the entire Pacific campaign. He spreads flight logs across the table. The numbers are undeniable. 25% reduction in fuel consumption. 180 miles of additional combat radius. 0 mechanical failures. Patterson listens with barely contained fury. When MacDonald finishes, the Allison representative stands slowly, his face flushed red. Gentlemen, what you're describing violates fundamental principles of engine operation. The Allison V1710 is designed to operate within specific parameters. Those parameters exist because physics exists. You cannot simply ignore metallurgical reality because a civilian with no engineering degree claims he knows better than our entire research department. Lindbergh speaks from his corner of the room. Mr. Patterson, I've read your technical manuals. They're excellent documents. But they're based on assumptions about how pilots operate engines in combat conditions. High power, rich mixture, maximum performance. We're not talking about combat operations. We're talking about cruise efficiency. The engine doesn't know the difference, Patterson snaps. Low RPM with high manifold pressure creates excessive cylinder pressure regardless of the tactical situation. You're risking detonation, piston failure, catastrophic engine seizure at altitude over hostile territory. Except we're not experiencing any of those things, MacDonald interrupts. We've now flown 16 missions using Mr. Lindbergh's technique. 16. We're monitoring temperatures constantly. The engines are running cooler than standard operations, not hotter. That's impossible. That's measurable. Lindbergh pulls out a graph showing cylinder head temperature comparisons. The data is clear. Engines running his technique show lower operating temperatures than engines running Allison's recommended settings. The lean mixture actually improves thermal efficiency. Less excess fuel means less evaporative cooling load. The cylinders run at optimal temperature, not maximum temperature. The room erupts. Barnes argues that Lindbergh is cherry-picking data. Patterson insists that catastrophic failure is inevitable, just a matter of time. Another engineering officer points out that Allison's testing program involved thousands of hours of dynamometer runs, establishing safe operating limits. Are they supposed to throw all that away because a civilian ran a few test flights? Colonel MacDonald, if you continue operating engines outside approved specifications, I will recommend grounding every P-38 in your group. Patterson's voice is cold. This is not a threat. This is protocol. The silence that follows is deafening. MacDonald's jaw tightens. His pilots are dying because they can't reach targets. And now he's being threatened with losing his aircraft entirely if he tries to fix the problem. Then a new voice cuts through the tension. Gentlemen, let me ask a simple question. General Ennis Whitehead, Deputy Commander of the 5th Air Force, has been sitting silently in the back of the room. Now he stands, pulling a folder from his briefcase. If we adopt this technique fleet-wide, what's the worst-case scenario? Patterson answers immediately. Widespread engine failures, sir. Potentially catastrophic. And if we don't adopt it? Silence. Because I'm looking at casualty reports. Whitehead opens his folder. In the last 6 weeks, we've lost 23 pilots to fuel exhaustion. Not combat. Fuel. They ran the numbers. They flew the mission. They didn't make it home. That's 23 pilots who followed your operating procedures, Mr. Patterson, and died because they couldn't reach targets within the P-38's approved range limitations. Patterson shifts uncomfortably, but says nothing. Mr. Lindbergh, Whitehead turns to face the aviator. You're telling me you can extend combat radius by 180 miles without damaging engines? I'm telling you I already have, sir. 16 times. And if I'm wrong, if these engines start failing, pilots will notice temperature anomalies during cruise and can immediately revert to standard procedures. The technique fails safely. You simply go back to high RPM and rich mixture. Whitehead stares at the ceiling for a long moment. The entire room holds its breath. Mr. Patterson, I appreciate Allison's concerns, but we're fighting a war, not publishing technical journals. Colonel MacDonald's group will continue using Mr. Lindbergh's technique. If, and only if, we see evidence of engine stress, we'll reassess. Until then, I want these procedures documented and distributed to every P-38 squadron in the theater. Patterson stands abruptly. Sir, I must protest in the strongest possible terms. This decision could result in widespread mechanical failures across the entire 5th Air Force. I will be filing a formal objection with Army Air Forces headquarters in Washington. Your protest is noted and overruled. Dismissed. The Allison representatives file out. Patterson pauses at the door, turning back to face Lindbergh with barely concealed contempt. When those engines start failing, Mr. Lindbergh, and they will fail, remember that you were warned by people who actually understand engineering. The door slams behind him. Whitehead pulls Lindbergh aside after the room empties. You better be right about this. Lindbergh nods. There's only one way to prove it to everyone, sir. Combat. Real missions. Real results. Not test flights. Not graphs. Blood and metal over enemy territory. Then let's give you that chance. July 28, 1944. The mission briefing is straightforward. Armed reconnaissance over Saram Island. 640 miles from Mockmer Aerodrome. 20 P-38 Lightnings from the 475th Fighter Group. 3 weeks ago, this mission would have been suicide. Today, every pilot in the briefing room knows the Lindbergh technique by heart. 1,600 RPM, 30 inches manifold pressure, auto-lean mixture. They've practiced it on training flights until the settings are muscle memory. The formation takes off at dawn, climbing into a sky painted orange and gold. Lindbergh flies as wingman to Colonel MacDonald, his civilian status technically making him an observer. But everyone knows he's been flying combat missions for weeks. Today, he'll prove his technique where it matters most. The P-38s cruise at 170 miles per hour, slower than standard doctrine recommends, but dramatically more efficient. Fuel gauges tick down at rates that would have seemed miraculous a month ago. At the 2-hour mark, when previous missions would have pilots nervously calculating reserves, these Lightnings have fuel to spare. At 0947 hours, MacDonald's radio crackles with contact reports. 7 Japanese aircraft, a lone Ki-51 Sonya bomber, with 6 A-6M0 fighters providing escort. The enemy formation is at 8,000 feet, diving toward the coast. The American fighters are perfectly positioned, and unlike every engagement before this day, they have options. MacDonald keys his radio. Satan, lead to all flights, tally-ho. 7 Bandits, Angels 8, heading 270. The P-38s roll inverted and dive. The Japanese pilots react immediately. But something is wrong. The American fighters are supposed to be low on fuel by now. They shouldn't have energy reserves for aggressive pursuit. Intelligence briefings have been clear. P-38s operating at these distances are vulnerable. Easy targets. But MacDonald's Lightning screams down at over 400 miles per hour. Energy to burn. His targeting pipper finds a 0. Hold steady. 3-second burst. The Zero's wing separates. The aircraft tumbles into a violent spin. Splash 1, MacDonald calls calmly. The dogfight lasts 8 minutes. When it ends, 3 Zeros are burning in the jungle below. Captain Shimada's Sonya has been destroyed. The remaining Japanese fighters flee toward Ambon, their pilots reporting to intelligence officers that the American P-38s somehow had unlimited fuel and impossible performance. MacDonald reforms his squadron. All flights, fuel check. One by one, the pilots report. Every P-38 has sufficient reserves for the return trip. Several have enough for an additional hour of combat. These are numbers that should not exist. The formation turns northeast toward home. They cruise using the Lindbergh technique. Engines humming. Temperatures nominal. Fuel consumption optimal. Below them stretches 640 miles of hostile ocean that has claimed so many American pilots. Today, it claims none. 20 P-38s took off. 20 P-38s return. When the mechanics inspect the engines that evening, they find something remarkable. After 12 combat missions, totaling 67 flight hours using the forbidden technique, the Allison V-1710s show less wear than engines operated under standard procedures for the same duration. The spark plugs are cleaner. The cylinder compression is higher. The oil analysis shows lower metal content. Patterson examines the data in stunned silence. The evidence is overwhelming. Everything Allison believed about their own engines was incomplete. "Gentlemen," he finally says, "I need to call Indianapolis." By August 15, 1944, Lindbergh's technique is officially incorporated into P-38 operations throughout the Pacific Theater. The formal designation is Extended Range Cruise Procedures, but every pilot calls it Flying the Lindbergh Way. The impact is immediate. Fuel exhaustion losses drop from 23 pilots per month to fewer than 3. Kill ratios surge as American fighters reach targets that were previously beyond their grasp. Japanese pilots report to their commanders that American aircraft have somehow developed new engines with impossible range. But success breeds attention, and attention breeds danger. On September 3, 1944, a Japanese intelligence officer files a report with Imperial General Headquarters in Tokyo. The Americans have developed a new operational technique that has dramatically extended their fighter range. Source unknown, method unknown, but the effect is unmistakable. P-38s are appearing over targets far beyond their supposed maximum radius. The report reaches Admiral Soimu Toyoda, commander of the combined fleet, within 48 hours. His response is immediate. Find out what they're doing, and find a way to stop it. The Japanese are about to launch a counteroffensive, not with bullets and bombs, with intelligence operations designed to uncover and neutralize the secret that's changing the war. And Charles Lindbergh, the civilian who rewrote aerial warfare, is about to become a target. A civilian with no engineering degree challenged everything the experts believed. Charles Lindbergh's forbidden engine technique, running P-38 Lightnings at 1,600 RPM with 30 inches manifold pressure and auto-lean mixture, extended combat radius by 180 miles. The 5th Air Force adopted it against Allison's furious protests. American pilots who should have died from fuel exhaustion started coming home with reserves to spare. But success in war never goes unnoticed. By September 1944, Japanese intelligence officers are filing urgent reports to Imperial General Headquarters. American P-38s are appearing over targets far beyond their known maximum range. Something has changed. Something dangerous. Admiral Soimu Toyoda, commander of the combined fleet, reads the intelligence summary with growing alarm. In August alone, Japanese air losses in the Southwest Pacific have increased by 43%. Bases that were once safely beyond American reach are now being systematically destroyed. Fuel depots, ammunition stores, communications centers, aircraft on the ground. The mathematics of the Pacific War is shifting against Japan. Toyota summons his intelligence chief. Find out what the Americans are doing, and find a way to stop it. The investigation takes 3 weeks. Japanese agents in neutral territories gather fragments of information. Captured American pilots are interrogated more aggressively. Technical analysts study wreckage of downed P-38s, searching for evidence of new engines or modified fuel systems. They find nothing. The engines are standard Allison V1710s. The fuel systems are unchanged. The airframes show no modifications.
This makes no sense, the chief technical officer reports to Toyota.
The Americans haven't changed their aircraft. They've changed something else, something we cannot see. The answer, when it finally comes, arrives through an intercepted radio transmission. American pilots discussing cruise settings, RPM numbers, manifold pressure, mixture ratios. They're operating their engines differently, the intelligence officer realizes. Not new technology, new technique. Toyota's response is immediate. If the Americans can extend their range through operational changes, Japan must adapt. New defensive perimeters are established, pulled back 200 miles from previous positions. Fighter patrols are increased over critical installations. Anti-aircraft batteries are concentrated around targets that were once considered safe. But adaptation costs resources Japan doesn't have. Every fighter pulled back for defense is a fighter not attacking American shipping.
Every anti-aircraft gun protecting a rear area base is a gun not defending the front lines.
The Lindbergh technique isn't just destroying Japanese aircraft. It's forcing Japan to restructure its entire Pacific defense strategy. And the Americans are just getting started. But the enemy isn't the only challenge Lindbergh faces. October 12, 1944. A P-38 from the 49th Fighter Group goes down over the Celebes Sea. The pilot, Lieutenant James Morrison, manages to transmit one final radio message before his aircraft hits the water. Engine failure, both engines. Cylinders seized. The investigation reveals a troubling pattern. Morrison was using the Lindbergh technique. He had been using it successfully for 6 weeks. But on this mission, something went wrong. Cylinder head temperatures spiked without warning. By the time Morrison noticed, both engines were already failing. The report lands on General Kenny's desk within 24 hours. Allison's representatives, who have been waiting for exactly this moment, demand an immediate suspension of extended-range cruise procedures. "We told you this would happen," Patterson says, barely concealing his satisfaction. "One pilot dead. How many more before you admit the technique is flawed?" The pressure mounts quickly. 3 more incidents are reported over the following week. 2 pilots manage emergency landings. 1 doesn't. Headlines in stateside newspapers begin asking questions. Is the Army Air Forces gambling with pilots' lives? Lindbergh examines the incident reports personally. Something doesn't add up. Thousands of missions have been flown using his technique. The failure rate should be consistent. Instead, these incidents cluster around specific aircraft and specific squadrons. He requests maintenance logs. What he finds changes everything. The failed aircraft all share a common factor. They were serviced by crews who didn't fully understand the technique's requirements. Standard maintenance procedures call for spark plug gaffs set for rich mixture operation. Lindbergh's lean mixture settings require tighter gaps. The maintenance crews, following old procedures, created a mismatch that caused irregular combustion and eventual failure. It's not the technique that's flawed. It's the training. Lindbergh presents his findings to Kenny. The general listens carefully, then makes a decision that will define the remainder of the Pacific Air War. We don't abandon what works. We fix what's broken. Mr. Lindbergh, I want you to personally train every maintenance crew in the theater. Every squadron. Every base. No exceptions. For the next 6 weeks, Lindbergh travels across the Pacific. New Guinea, The Philippines, Morotai, Leyte. He conducts training sessions that last 12 hours. He inspects maintenance facilities.
He answers questions from skeptical mechanics who've been told their entire careers that what he's teaching is impossible. By December 1944, the failure rate drops to 0. And then comes the mission that proves everything. January 7th, 1945, Clark Field, Philippines. The target is Formosa. Japanese aircraft based there have been savaging American supply lines for months. Bombers, fighters, reconnaissance planes. The island is a dagger pointed at the heart of MacArthur's liberation campaign. The distance from Clark Field to Formosa is 620 miles. Round trip, 1,240 miles. Before Lindbergh, this mission would have been impossible for P-38 fighters. Today, 48 Lightnings from the 475th and 49th Fighter Groups are preparing to prove otherwise. Colonel MacDonald briefs the pilots at 0430 hours. The room is tense. Everyone knows what's at stake. This isn't just a combat mission. This is a demonstration that the Lindbergh technique works at scale, under combat conditions, against heavily defended targets. Gentlemen, we're going to hit them where they think they're safe. We're going to show them that nowhere is beyond our reach anymore. Standard Lindbergh cruise settings outbound. Save your fuel. Save your ammunition. When we get there, we unleash hell. The formation takes off into pre-dawn darkness. 48 aircraft, 96 Allison engines, all running at settings that Allison's own engineers said would destroy them. The flight to Formosa takes 3 hours and 40 minutes. The P-38s cruise at 1,600 RPMs, 30 inches manifold pressure, auto-lean mixture. Fuel gauges drop steadily but slowly. By the time the formation reaches the Formosan coast, every pilot has reserves that previous operations would never have allowed. Japanese radar detects them at 0847 hours. The response is immediate but confused. American fighters shouldn't be here. The nearest American bases are too far away. This must be carrier aircraft. But carriers would have been detected. There are no American carriers within 500 miles. The air raid sirens at Tainan Airfield begin wailing at 0852 hours. Japanese pilots sprint toward their aircraft. Ground crews scramble to arm and fuel Zeros that were scheduled for routine maintenance. Anti-aircraft gunners swing their weapons toward the approaching formation. They're too late. MacDonald's P-38s dive out of the morning sun at 0854 hours. The first pass catches a dozen Japanese aircraft still on the ground. Fuel trucks explode. Ammunition stores detonate in secondary blasts that send debris hundreds of feet into the air. Hangars collapse under concentrated .50 caliber fire. The Zeros that manage to get airborne face a nightmare. American P-38s with energy. American P-38s with ammunition. American P-38s that aren't desperately conserving fuel for the return trip. Lieutenant Robert Anderson describes the engagement in his after-action report. It was like nothing I'd ever experienced. We had fuel to fight. We could pursue. We could engage. We could stay in the combat zone and finish what we started, instead of breaking off to save gas. The battle over Tainan lasts 23 minutes. When the last P-38 breaks off and turns south toward Clark Field, the airfield below is devastated. 27 Japanese aircraft destroyed on the ground. 11 more shot down in aerial combat. Fuel storage facilities burning. The primary maintenance hangar reduced to rubble. Japanese fighter operations from Tainan will be crippled for 6 weeks. American losses: 2 P-38s, both pilots rescued by submarine. The formation returns to Clark Field at 13:40 hours. Every aircraft that wasn't shot down makes it home. Fuel reserves average 45 gallons per aircraft, enough for another 30 minutes of flight. Before Lindbergh, this mission couldn't have happened. After Lindbergh, it becomes routine. News of the Tainan raid spreads through the Pacific Theater within days. Squadrons that were skeptical of the technique demand immediate training. Maintenance crews study the new procedures with religious intensity. The phrase, "flying the Lindbergh way," becomes shorthand for operational excellence. The statistics tell the story more eloquently than any words. Between July 1944 and April 1945, P-38 squadrons using extended-range cruise procedures destroy 1,430 Japanese aircraft that would have been beyond reach using conventional methods. Fuel exhaustion losses drop by 67% across the entire P-38 fleet. An estimated 234 American pilots survived the war, who would have died using standard operating procedures. Japanese commanders watched their defensive perimeters collapse. Bases that were once safely in the rear become frontline targets. Supply lines that were protected by distance become vulnerable to attack. The mathematics of the Pacific War, which once favored Japan's interior position, now favors American reach and aggression. In March 1945, Allison Engine Company quietly revises their technical manuals. The prohibited operating range becomes the recommended cruise setting. Page 47, paragraph 3, is rewritten completely. No acknowledgement that this directly contradicts their previous specifications. No mention of the civilian who proved them wrong. Robert Patterson, Allison's field representative, who fought so hard against the technique, writes a letter to Lindbergh after the war. "Sir, I owe you an apology. Your instincts about engine efficiency were correct, and our testing protocols were incomplete. The V1710 is a better engine because you questioned our assumptions. Thank you." The war ends in August 1945. The Lindbergh technique has been adopted by every P-38 squadron in both Pacific and European theaters. Over 8,000 pilots have been trained in extended-range cruise procedures. Charles Lindbergh returns to civilian life, his wartime contributions classified and largely unknown to the public. The man who crossed the Atlantic solo in 1927 has quietly revolutionized aerial warfare. But unlike his famous transatlantic flight, there are no parades, no headlines, no ticker-tape celebrations. The forbidden technique that saved hundreds of lives and helped win the Pacific War fades into technical manuals and maintenance procedures. But the story isn't over, because what happened to Charles Lindbergh after the war, and why his Pacific service remained hidden for decades, reveals something unexpected about heroism, controversy, and the complicated nature of legacy. In Part 4, we'll discover the truth about why Lindbergh's wartime contributions were deliberately obscured, why a man who saved hundreds of American lives was denied official recognition, and how, decades later, the pilots who flew with him finally told the world what really happened. The most surprising chapter of this story is still waiting to be told. A civilian with no engineering degree walked into an operations tent and told America's best fighter pilots that everything they knew was wrong. Charles Lindbergh's forbidden engine technique, running P-38 Lightnings at settings that Allison's engineers swore would destroy the engines, extended combat radius by 180 miles. It saved 234 American pilots from fuel exhaustion deaths. It helped destroy over 1,400 Japanese aircraft. It changed the mathematics of the Pacific War. But when the guns fell silent in August 1945, something strange happened. The man who revolutionized aerial warfare simply disappeared from the story. No medals, no recognition, no place in the official histories of the air war. This is where the story takes its most unexpected turn. Because the reason Charles Lindbergh was denied credit for his wartime contributions has nothing to do with aviation, and everything to do with politics, controversy, and the complicated nature of American memory. The war ends. Heroes return home to parades and ticker-tape celebrations. Generals write memoirs. Pilots become celebrities. The men who flew P-38s using the Lindbergh technique know exactly who saved their lives. But Charles Lindbergh receives nothing. The reason traces back to 1941, before Pearl Harbor, when Lindbergh was the most famous voice of the America First movement. He spoke at rallies urging the United States to stay out of the European war. He made statements that critics called pro-German, even anti-Semitic. President Franklin Roosevelt personally despised him. When Lindbergh tried to rejoin the Army Air Corps after Pearl Harbor, Roosevelt blocked his commission. That's why Lindbergh was in the Pacific as a civilian consultant. He couldn't serve officially. The President of the United States had personally ensured that the most famous aviator in American history would never wear a uniform again. So, when Lindbergh's technique saved hundreds of lives and helped win the air war, the military faced an impossible situation. How do you honor a man the commander-in-chief has declared persona non grata? How do you give medals to someone who technically wasn't supposed to be flying combat missions at all? The answer was simple. You don't. Lindbergh's contributions were classified. His name was removed from official reports. The technique he developed was renamed Extended Range Cruise Procedures, with no mention of its creator. The pilots who flew with him were quietly discouraged from discussing his involvement. Charles Lindbergh returned to civilian life and never spoke publicly about his Pacific service. When aviation journalists tried to interview him about specific missions, he declined. When the War Department considered issuing a commendation years later, he quietly suggested they honor Colonel MacDonald instead. In 1954, President Eisenhower finally restored Lindbergh's military commission and promoted him to Brigadier General in the Air Force Reserve. At the ceremony, reporters asked about his wartime contributions. Lindbergh's response was characteristically modest. I simply applied some old lessons to a new problem. The real heroes are the pilots who trusted the technique and brought their aircraft home safely. One of those pilots, retired Lieutenant Colonel James Watkins, wrote to Lindbergh in 1968, "Sir, I never met you personally, but I flew with the 475th from July 1944 until war's end. I want you to know that every time I landed with fuel to spare after a long mission, I thought about you. Because of you, I came home. Because of you, I met my wife, had my children, lived my life." How do you thank someone for that? Charles Lindbergh died on August 26, 1974, at his home in Hawaii. His obituaries focused on his 1927 transatlantic flight. Few mentioned the Pacific. Almost none detailed the engine technique that saved hundreds of lives. But his legacy didn't die with him. It evolved. Modern aviation still uses the principles Lindbergh demonstrated in 1944. Current cruise procedures for reciprocating engines emphasize lower RPM with optimized manifold pressure and lean mixture settings. Exactly what he taught those skeptical mechanics 80 years ago. Flight schools today teach LOP operations, lean of peak, a direct descendant of Lindbergh's technique. Every student pilot learning to maximize fuel efficiency is unknowingly applying lessons that a civilian observer developed over the jungles of New Guinea. The impact extends far beyond propeller aircraft.
The fundamental principle that manufacturer specifications often reflect conservative assumptions rather than true operational limits revolutionized how the military approaches equipment performance. Engineers learned to distinguish between what machines can do and what manuals say they can do. During the Korean War, pilots flying F-51 Mustangs applied similar techniques to extend their combat radius over the peninsula. In Vietnam, helicopter crews developed fuel management procedures that echoed Lindbergh's methodology. The philosophy spread across services and across decades. The numbers tell the complete story. Over 8,000 P-38 pilots were trained in extended-range cruise procedures before the war ended. The technique contributed to 1,430 additional enemy aircraft destroyed. Fuel exhaustion losses dropped by 67% across the entire P-38 fleet. Conservative estimates suggest the extended-range capability shortened the Pacific Air War by 4 to 6 months. 4 to 6 months.
Thousands of lives on both sides. Billions of dollars in resources. All because one man asked a question that everyone else was afraid to ask. What if the experts are wrong? The lesson here extends far beyond aviation. It's about how institutions resist change, even when change could save lives. It's about how expertise can become a prison, trapping smart people inside assumptions they never think to question. Allison's engineers weren't stupid. They were brilliant. They had thousands of hours of test data. They had metallurgical analyses and stress calculations and thermal models. They knew their engines. But they knew them under laboratory conditions, not combat conditions. They knew them as machines, not as tools in the hands of desperate pilots flying impossible missions. Lindbergh brought something the engineers lacked: operational intuition. The ability to see the gap between how things work in theory and how they work in practice.
The courage to test his intuition even when everyone said he was wrong. History is filled with similar stories. The doctor who proposed that surgeons should wash their hands was mocked by the medical establishment. The engineer who suggested that ships could be built from iron instead of wood was called insane. The general who believed tanks could win wars faster than cavalry was ignored until the Germans proved him right. Innovation rarely comes from the center of expertise. It comes from the edges, from people who see problems with fresh eyes, who aren't trapped by the assumptions that experts accumulate over careers of specialized knowledge. Today, in boardrooms and laboratories and military planning centers around the world, there are people with unconventional ideas being told what they propose is impossible. Some of those ideas are genuinely bad, but some of them are Lindbergh moments waiting to happen. The challenge is telling the difference. And here's the detail that most people don't know. In 2003, researchers examining declassified wartime documents discovered something remarkable. Charles Lindbergh kept a detailed personal journal during his Pacific service. In it, he recorded not just the technical aspects of his engine experiments, but his thoughts about war, mortality, and the strange position he occupied as a controversial civilian flying combat missions he wasn't supposed to fly. One entry, dated July 29, 1944, the day after the Saram Island mission, reveals something unexpected. I killed a man today. His aircraft went down in flames. I watched it fall. I keep thinking about who he was. Did he have a family? Children? Was he brave or terrified in those final seconds? The technique works. The fuel savings are proven. But I cannot celebrate. Not tonight. War makes murderers of us all, even those of us who believe we're saving lives. The man who revolutionized aerial warfare and saved 234 American pilots never forgot that his success came at a cost measured in Japanese lives.
He never spoke about his combat kills publicly. He never sought glory for the missions he flew. The journal entries show a man deeply conflicted about his role in the violence, even as he worked tirelessly to give American pilots every possible advantage. Perhaps that's why he refused recognition. Perhaps the modest deflection wasn't just humility. Perhaps it was something closer to penance. From a controversial civilian who wasn't supposed to be there, to a technique that changed the Pacific War, Charles Lindbergh proved that innovation doesn't require credentials. It requires courage. The courage to question what everyone accepts as truth. The courage to test your ideas when experts say they're impossible. The courage to persist when institutions push back. 234 pilots came home because of that courage. 1,400 enemy aircraft were destroyed. The war ended months earlier than it might have, and modern aviation still flies using principles that a 42-year-old civilian demonstrated over hostile jungles 80 years ago. The next time someone tells you that something can't be done, remember Charles Lindbergh standing in that operations tent, facing down engineers who said his technique would destroy engines. Remember the P-38s returning with fuel to spare from missions that should have been impossible. Remember that the line between impossible and revolutionary is often just one person willing to ask the right question. What if they're wrong? If you know another story of wartime innovation that deserves to be told, share it in the comments. This is just one of hundreds of moments when unconventional thinking changed the course of history. Subscribe to discover more forgotten heroes whose courage shaped the world we live in today. Because sometimes, the most dangerous thing you can do is accept what everyone else believes. And sometimes, the most powerful weapon isn't a gun or a bomb or an aircraft. It's a question.